The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
Our guest has a bold vision for natural, holistic land management. And he's not just thinking about how water harvesting and land management can complement or even replace traditional water resources engineering. He's putting it into practice personally and professionally. Welcome to Season 7, Episode 1. I am delighted to be kicking off Season 7 with my eminent co-host, Jeff King, lead of the Engineering with Nature program. That's him laughing in the background. And our special guest, Ricardo Aguirre. Jeff, Ricardo is truly practicing engineering with nature on the ground in Arizona.
He certainly is, and I'm so glad to share a bit about our guest. I actually met Ricardo back in March of 2022, and this was out at Marine Corps Air Station Yuma in Yuma, Arizona. And we had a chance to talk about how we keep water in these very arid lands, keep that water on soils. And so we had a nice dinner together that evening, and I found his work to be absolutely fascinating. So very delighted to have Ricardo here with us today. And Ricardo's an engineer, he's a rancher, a consultant, and he's accredited as a holistic management professional and educator. He has 25 years of experience working on hydrology, stormwater management, flood control, and groundwater recharge. And he's currently the director of land management and water security for West Consultants in Arizona and executive director of DAAWN, which is the Drylands Alliance addressing water needs. So Ricardo, welcome, and please share with us a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that introduction, and that evening with you was very memorable. I really enjoyed that dinner and the time with you and Todd Bridges there at that military workshop. Very exciting that the Navy and the Army Corps is looking to the land that the DoD owns and looking to restore that land. A bit about my background, Jeff. I'm a farm boy. Grew up on a cattle ranch and a cotton farm here in southern Arizona. Unfortunately, the family operation didn't make it, and so they recommended I didn't continue in agriculture. So I went on to become a civil engineer, and at that time, I have to give my mom some credit. She was signaling to me that she sensed that water was going to be the future here in the Southwest, and she actually recommended I become a water attorney. But at that time, I didn't read too fast, so and math was more my thing. So I ended up going into civil engineering and focusing on water resources. Went to University of Arizona, and then I went and got a graduate degree at the University of Illinois. Actually, I worked for the Corps at CERL, and the Corps actually paid my way through my master's program. I was offered a full ride fellowship, but it was time for me to get out and start practicing engineering. Looking back at agriculture, we were a family that practiced chemically supported industrial agriculture because that's what everybody was kind of sold to do. And we didn't really understand regenerative agriculture, which I'm sure we'll be getting into in this conversation. That's probably part of the reason the operation didn't make it, because the more chemicals you put in the ground, it's almost like the ground becomes an addict to those chemicals. We proceeded along with those practices, and the like I said, the operation didn't make it, and here I am as in front of you. I'm sure, like I say, we'll get into it when we come to regenerative agriculture.
Absolutely.
We sure will. Thanks, that's good context, Ricardo. Good background so that we know a little bit about you. I was wondering if you could talk more about your family connection to the land. Your mom sounds like a very wise woman, but what got you thinking about different ways to manage the land and the water on the ranch? What was the impetus for that?
That chemically supported industrial agriculture, and earlier in my career, I was working for a land development company, and I felt like I was trading monoculture cotton in for monoculture residential housing, and both were not conducive to work with nature and conducive to advance supporting the environment. On the farm, Sarah, the practices that we incorporated were pumping groundwater to irrigate high demand cotton and alfalfa crops, which is needed. And it's not to take anything away from that. I think that there's a management practice that would be important because cotton is a major commodity that supports the world's products, from food and clothing. And alfalfa, you can find its products in many foods as well. So it's just a way of doing it and making sure we do it properly. But it was really just being around water, how water conveyed through irrigation ditches, how it came out of the pumps, that I guess just kept with me, and why I decided to focus in water resources as I went into engineering.
Yeah, Ricardo, well, this is a very interesting story, and certainly what you've shared with us thus far, all sorts of really interesting discussion threads are coming to mind for me. And this idea of mismanagement of land. And I know you've got an interesting story there about seeing dust storms and perhaps an accident on some interstate, and how you were starting to connect the dots even then in terms of the importance of managing land correctly. Can you maybe share that story with our listeners?
Sure, you bet. So when I was growing up on the farm here, I had experienced with my family several major dust storms, but they were much rarer at that time compared to what we experience now. And I just thought that was the normal course of action as a weather event. But the arc of my career brought me full circle. I began to reflect back at what was actually going on, and I'd realized that the way that my family had practiced grazing, which was a conventional grazing approach, really gave rise to those dust storms. We owned some deeded land, but we also had state land leases between where I'm at now, which is where I grew up in Red Rock. We're in between Phoenix and Tucson. And according to ADOT, we're actually on the south end of the worst 10-mile stretch in the state that causes fatalities and accidents and injuries on Interstate 10. And so our property was adjacent to Interstate 10. And truth be told, the way I see it, with all due respect to my elders, the way we practice grazing gave rise to those issues on the interstate that land was adjacent to. And so part of my mission is to rewrite a new chapter, and I'd like to say our family's history, and hopefully rehabilitate those lands and begin to protect the motorist on that interstate.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's a very interesting story. And I think also you've got another sort of demonstration site as well that you've been working, and pertains to perhaps a horse pasture. Maybe you could elaborate on that for us as well.
Yeah, I think that Jeff, that allows me to continue to round out where I'm at in my career. So as I traded in monocultural cotton and traded in the housing tops for land development companies, I began to proceed towards my own firm that I founded. It was Holistic Engineering and Land Management, but then I teamed up with the company I'm currently working with, West Consultants, to go after large NRCS PL 566 projects, which is Congress's Watershed Protection Flood Prevention Act. And working on this first project, was with Cochise County, and the folks at West, I guess, got an opportunity to see how I manage a project. And so the Tempe office manager and the former owner of West began to, I guess, kind of romance me to consider coming over there. And at the time, things weren't right, but within about a year or so, I started to look at the opportunities that West could offer me and the vision that I have and the resources. And so I interviewed with them and told them what the vision was, and that vision relates to an organization called the Savory Institute. Maybe we get into that a little bit later, but that the Savory Institute has a endeavor to restore the world's grasslands through a hub model, and that each of these hubs require a piece of land. And so when I presented that to the former owner of West, the conversation went such that this horse pasture that you mentioned, Jeff, was for sale. It used to be in our family. It is also adjacent to Interstate 10. And so he, through West, purchased that horse pasture, and that became the demonstration site that we are actively improving today to satisfy my commission as accredited professional with the Savory Institute, as well as use it for basically visibility for West and what we're doing to develop this land management service line.
So, Ricardo, your story and really your deep personal connection to the land, it's very moving, and I can see how it's very motivating for you. I want to dig into what this thing called regenerative land management is. Tell us about that and why you believe this approach is so important now. Maybe you could start by defining regenerative land management.
So regenerative land management basically is working with nature and understanding nature's patterns. And my approach in wanting to drill down into what I call first principles thinking has allowed me to begin to understand these complex systems, which I think is important to decipher that and the difference that it holds with complicated systems. So under a complex system, you really just have to recognize that there is an infinite number of variables that we cannot control, that typically science and technology is accustomed to when developing under a complicated model, which is machine-like model, assembly line thinking. This idea of controlling all but one variable to test a hypothesis, that's fundamentally science. And so when it comes to regenerative management of our bodies, of our land, we need to look and be able to manage all these different types of variables, which are, again, too many for the human mind to be able to handle. So it really just becomes an understanding of how patterns work. A handful of these first principles thinking really starts with, can we all agree that the sun comes up every day? And so we separate opinion from justified belief, which is more of an epistological approach as opposed to a scientific approach. And then you go from there, and can we all agree that it rains every day? And then as you proceed down that list, do we stand on 6 inches of topsoil and so on and so forth? And so eventually you begin to recognize that there are these relationships that we can put together. The relationship of photosynthesis and how plants use that energy from the sun to create exudates in the roots that feed bacteria and fungal matter, and that bacteria and fungal matter then gets consumed by predators in the soil called protozoa. And then as the protozoa excrete their extracts, that's what becomes plant available for the plant to get their nutrients. And then eventually that nutrients uptakes other parent material, animals consume it, and the list goes on. So this is basically a very rigorous response to how things regenerate. At the end of the day, all life on Earth comes down to green growing plants on regenerating soils. And that's really what our mission is soil health and how we can scale up using megafauna, in our case, livestock, to help that mineral cycle that I basically just described.
So in this system of systems, to understand how the land regenerates, you have some principles, and I thought some of them were really interesting. Can you talk about some of them?
The very first principle is, I think I might have mentioned it at that workshop, Jeff, is this law I came across called the Lindy effect. And the Lindy effect basically says that something that's been around for a long time has a propensity of being around a long time, and something that has not been around for very long is vulnerable to extinction. And so as a civil engineer, when I began to really question what I was taught in school, I began to realize that my education was born out of the industrial age that's only been around for 150 years. And when I began to look at nature inspired by things like the birth of my son and what kind of legacy I was going to leave behind for him, his generation and beyond, and I discovered that life on planet Earth has been around for 4 billion years, and you overlay that on the Lindy effect, you begin to realize that maybe nature is something that we want to partner with, because she's had it dialed in. These relationships between ecology, geomorphology, and hydrology have essentially become perfected. And before we came along, whatever measure you want to use, but 10,000 years, 200,000 years, but our existence as humans, we've been around also a very short period of time compared to life on planet Earth. And so nature already has a model ready for us to observe. So that's one, Sarah. And again, as I was getting into a moment ago, those next ones, the next first principles thinking is that I believe that we need megafauna to manage the Earth's landforms. What I've learned here in the desert is that without the benefit of megafauna managed properly, it really demands that type of biological activity in order for these deserts to be what they once were, which was grasslands. And there is a record of that even within my family. And I might have mentioned that at least before we started the recording, I am married to a woman in Sweden, so I got to learn about the temperate climates over there. And what I found out is that megafauna is also necessary to maintain landforms, grassland landforms, which really does the yeoman's work in the carbon cycle and the water cycle. And so if those animals are not there, then forests begin to move in. And a lot of people think that trees are our salvation. And in reality, it's in between when it comes to the arid landforms and the temperate landforms. And so that was, let's say, my second first principle. The third of which I also mentioned is this relationship that plants and microorganisms have with the exchange of energy coming from the sun, and how all that interaction works from photosynthesis to exudates and so on and so forth when it comes to keeping that soil life in the soil, making sure that soils don't collapse, become compacted. Once soils become compacted, it is the precursor for all things that are symptoms of desertification, from dust, excess flooding, soil loss, long-term water security, wildfires, invasive species, and the list goes on. So those are probably my top three, I'd say, first principles thinking, once we all can agree that the sun comes up every day.
That's great.
Well, and
Jeff, I can agree to that. Can you?
Yeah, I'm sold. I think that's
Okay.
I could get behind that one pretty quick. And there was something else that Ricardo said that I thought was really nice, which was nature already has it dialed in. And we talk about T-shirt logos and other kinds of sayings, and I want to make sure that I remember that one for a very long time. I really, really like that.
That's great. So, Ricardo, talk about how you're putting these principles to work in your consulting practice, but also on your own land, on your ranch.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I emphasize and give credit where credit's due. So when you refer to my ranch, the area used to be with my family as a ranch and a cotton farm. Unfortunately, like I say, the family operation didn't make it. I've been able to come back and do some family transition planning with my mom. And so what little is left, I've been able to purchase, but really it's West Consultants that deserves the credit for having that demonstration site. And so that's what what it is that we are running experiments on. We've already had before and after pictures on either papers I've written or things I've posted on LinkedIn. What we've done is we have used high density grazing. So I mentioned already what conventional grazing is. It's basically very few animals in very large areas for very long periods of time. And we're endeavoring to do the opposite. We're looking to get quite a few animals, a high density of animals in very small areas for very short periods of time to disturb that land, evenly distribute dung and urine and the trampling of plants back in to feed those soil organisms. And then those animals will not come back to that same place until it's ready to be grazed again. So we've used sheep to start. I think it's important to pay attention to the animal class depending on the condition of the land. And those sheep had performed very well. And so we're very proud of the before and after pictures that we have. But now we are looking to make improvements with perimeter fence and water lines and begin to bring in cattle that are going to advance that ecological succession. And so that's where we're at right now. We also have some technologies that we are looking. If I can just add this real quick, Sarah, that as an engineer operating under concrete and steel, I know that my clients are expecting a project to be delivered within 18 to 36 months. That's the traditional delivery time period of any engineering facility, at least within the flood control arena. So I'm looking for accelerators that would complement regenerative grazing. And so we've been fortunate that technologies have reached out to us, and when it makes sense, we will invite those technologies in to demonstrate them on West's demonstration site and see if we can complement planned grazing, to see if we can use nature or partner with nature and see if we can deliver, let's say, a flood control outcome with nature as fast as we would deliver what I would call symptomatic relief using concrete and steel to, let's say, attenuate flow, so that we can kind of compete with the industrial way or approach to civil infrastructure.
Interesting.
So give us a practical example, Ricardo. How do you see that working for you or for one of your clients? How does that work?
Yeah, I think the best way to give you that example is the work we're doing with Cochise County. You know, we've got a 480-acre project that we have been at for, I think since 2017. And one of the things I've done to deliver a land management project is I've used my engineering design experience to borrow, let's say, pages from that engineering design notebook and to take a client through that process. And so what we did with Cochise County is we did a planning phase. We went in and we figured out the conditions of the land. We wrote, we went through an alternatives formulation and we came up with the recommended alternative. I was fortunate to get a mentor in as a sub-consultant, and we delivered a land plan that then went into phase 2, and that was constructed. And so within that land plan, it basically consisted of an internal electric fence that we were able to tether mobile fence from and move the animals around in a strip grazing pattern. We also dug a water line, so those animals would have water every paddock that was in the shape of a strip. And then we were finally now into our implementation phase. So we've had the animals out there for 1 year. We're going to be meeting with the county in about a week to look to be turning the animals back out again. So it's what I was saying before. It is high density grazing where we can distribute the dung and urine and the trampling of the existing plant material so that we can feed those organisms. And so now, with that background, Sarah, it really comes down to this metric or this relationship. And it's a relationship between soil organic matter and soil water holding capacity. And the metric that I think is worth mentioning is that for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, the land can retain an additional 20 to 60,000 gallons of water per acre. And so therein lies...
That's astonishing.
Yeah. My contemporaries, with all due respect to them, I don't know of any flood control engineer that's looking at soil health and its relation to mitigating compaction. And then when you mitigate compaction, you mitigate evaporation. So what usually happens when in desertified lands, you've got a lot of runoff when there's a big heavy rain, and the water that does not run off and soaks in the soil will then evaporate. And evaporation is vulnerable in some areas up to 30 feet deep. And so you're really not getting that water in the ground, and you're really not optimizing the use of that land to retain that water, mitigate against flooding, and also when you're retaining that water, getting that water in the ground past the root zones and recharging the local aquifer. So that's what it is that we are doing in Cochise County. It happens to be one of 8 recharge facilities along the San Pedro River. Cochise County and other local governments have an organization called the Cochise Conservation Recharge Network. This is the only land management of the 8. The rest are all civil infrastructure designed to get water in the ground.
Ricardo, that is really interesting. And the level of detail that you shared is just incredible. And certainly looking forward to hearing more about this as it matures and some of the results that you are able to obtain as this study progresses. And it really does strike me that you really are sort of harnessing natural processes in many respects to be able to create the desired environment and the soils to be able to retain the water. And that really harkens back to a lot of what we promote and like to see when it comes to engineering with nature projects.
Yeah, it's just fantastic that you're able to do this, and we'll show in the show notes some of your before and after pictures because it's quite astounding. Power to the cows and sheep that are out there doing all the legwork.
Actually, yeah, that's I like how you phrased that, because here's the deal when it comes to nature compared to industrial thinking. The engine of economy is run off of the labor force of humans, but when you partner with nature, you get a free, what I like to call Googleplex of organisms that you can hire that'll just go to work for you. And it could be what you said, Sarah, power to the sheep and the animals. I mean, all you have to do is feed them, but they can feed themselves when you're managing properly. And then they feed those free trillions upon trillions of organisms in the soil that are also going to work for you just because of the energy of this coming from the sun.
Yeah.
That's fabulous.
It is. It really is.
As you said right off the bat, nature had it already worked out.
Yeah, exactly.
We just have to pay attention. Yeah. So, Ricardo, I know that you're really committed to advancing this practice. Can you talk a little bit about the holistic management accreditation that you have and the courses that you're developing for other people? Sure.
So as I mentioned earlier, I am affiliated with the Savory Institute. The namesake is from Alan Savory. He, in a way, has been a mentor of mine. I had the opportunity of submitting a business plan back in 2014, which got accepted. And as a result, I was able to go to Alan's ranch in Zimbabwe and see really the impact of what holistic management can be. A little bit about that. I got off the plane, I think it was Victoria Falls, and we drove and everything was desertified, just like here in Arizona. And then suddenly we show up on his ranch and it's an oasis where ephemeral streams, or let's say washes with no water in it. And then you show up on his ranch and all the washes had water in it and the depressions had water in it and there were grasslands. And so I was like, something's here. And in a way, pun intended, that was one watershed moment for me in my career. So as a result, that was being that moment, I began to look into what he was teaching and began to realize that there were opportunities to scale up and over and offer to my clients. And so holistic management basically consists of what I would call four modules: holistic financial planning, holistic ecological monitoring, holistic land planning, and holistic planned grazing. And so these are the things I am accredited as a professional to train. Cochise County, who I mentioned, was my first opportunity. The county engineer who knew Alan back in the 80s and was trained under holistic management under a different program. That's how really I give so much credit to Cochise County for having this vision. But she hired me under that first contract to come in and train her staff in holistic management.
Wow.
In order to maintain the perpetuity of that project. What we're doing under West and through DAAWN, this nonprofit, which, by the way, is the Savory Hub. That is the nonprofit. It's that Jeff mentioned in the beginning. I put a bit of a twist. Fortunately, the Savory Institute allows latitude in how I teach. I will say that amongst my peers around the world, it seems that I'm the only hub that is focused in water, where the others are focused in rangeland management and food security. So I imbue into the training a heavy dose of water security, water harvesting, and other type of permaculture practices that are water centric.
Yeah. Well,
fabulous.
Yeah, I agree.
Fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this idea of offering courses and to be able to train that next generation of practitioners and others, it's absolutely the right way to go. And we see that firsthand as well within the program and how we're collaborating with academic institutions to also put forward information about nature-based solutions. So it's wonderful to hear that you two are pursuing this direction and being able to offer training to the next generation and those that are interested present day. I'm sure you're going to get a very high level of response and interest in what you have to offer there.
And your courses are going to be offered starting 2024. Is that what your timing is?
Yes, that's the plan.
Excellent. Well, before we let you go, we want to talk to you about how these practices, your regenerative land practices, could be applied to other large-scale land practices. How do you move that approach forward?
Well, this is where I'm, to be honest, so excited to be connected with Jeff and the Engineering with Nature program. 480 acres is a great size to demonstrate the potential. But if we're going to make a difference, we need to really go to the level of that workshop that Jeff and I were at, that he and Todd Bridges had hosted, and where we're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres. And that's where I'm certain that the rubber hits the road, is to be able to scale up to that level. And so that type of project, I believe, is needed. Fortunately, we do have a couple opportunities. One in an urban environment, but one is also similar to what I mentioned about here with the Department of Transportation. We also have a contract with New Mexico Department of Transportation for roughly about a 42,000 acre site. But it really takes a level of concentration. So I'm interested in these military installations. Again, partnering with Jeff and Engineering with Nature to see if there could be a proving ground opportunity where we could just really scale up on several thousand acres and partner with either the BLM or a state land department or something, and perhaps one of your districts, Jeff, to get something off the ground and be able to showcase the power of megafauna and for people to come and see. That's why I think this is a great location for a demonstration site, because we are adjacent to Interstate 10 in between Phoenix and Tucson, where people can easily come and just drive by and see what I saw in Zimbabwe, but right next to a major thoroughfare here in the U.S. And so that's how I think we would be getting the word out, is by scaling up to a large project that's meaningful, be able to take the measurements, have the metrics, get the data, and invite people over for eventually what we want to do, which is tours, walking tours, and eventually maybe kind of a hayride or a Jeep tour as we get out. And not only the private sector could come over and learn about how they can adjust their management practices, but also the public sector from local, state, and federal level.
You've definitely got some wonderful ideas here, Ricardo. You've clearly thought about this. And so let's go 10 years into the future. And where do you see this going? In a perfect world, what would you like to have accomplished in that 10-year period of time?
Well, where do I see this going? That's a good question. I think the U.S. has a huge opportunity if they look to their land mass and to be able to rehabilitate the land that has been degraded over really the course of the last 100 years. When you look back before industrialization came in, and our relationship with land and how we have managed our lands through agriculture and industrial agriculture, be specific. So I'd like to see a transformation of those practices in rangeland and in farmlands. And all the evidence is there. There are luminaries within the space that we're talking to. I'm very fortunate to be connected to some of these luminaries, to get more aggressive in large-scale land restoration.
Right.
And in doing so, this is where I think, in my personal opinion, security, homeland security, the security of our nation, can really be given rise to something that is going to support the health of our citizens, increase the health of our resources that support our citizens, and all its relationships that we have in the interactions with these other agencies, from the military to our economic approach, our education. I think there's a nexus between all these different disciplines, from the federal government to the state government to the local government. And it's all, in my opinion, rooted in the quality of the resources that we're managing, because at the end of the day, it just comes down to resource management. And I think the better a country manages their resources, the better position they're in to defend themselves and make contributions to other countries around the world. Let me mention another metric here in the spirit of what I've learned from a philosophical standpoint when it comes to nature, that when the Soviet Union fell, the citizens were forced to become subsistent farmers and live off the land. And one metric that I discovered recently, and I think this to me really woke me up, especially because I've got children, and it's not about me anymore. In the U.S., it takes 12 calories of petroleum fuel to make 1 calorie of nutrition. But in the Soviet Union, because they were forced, given the former Soviet Union, because of the breakup, those citizens living off that land, it's 1-to-1. So for every 1 calorie of petroleum fuel, will earn 1 calorie of nutrition. So to me, that's something we need to be looking at, because we've been doubling down on our strengths, which is technology. And this is I think one example or one signal of how vulnerable that we could potentially be. So that's why I think it's really important, like you say, Jeff, or like you asked, 10 years from now, I'd like to see that relationship get closer to 1-to-1.
Very good. Very good. Interesting. That's very thought-provoking, too. I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Ricardo, your approach is absolutely fascinating. And I have to say, it just makes so much sense. It fully understanding and respecting nature, the power of nature, taking a holistic approach to land management challenges that we face. It just sounds practical, but it also sounds, to my mind, very mindful. It's a very mindful approach, putting nature back in context. So back to your first principle. So thank you so much for coming on, for sharing your passion and really your deep expertise in this area with us. I hope that our conversation will be as inspiring for our listeners as it has been for Jeff and me.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and the comment that sticks in my mind is nature already has it dialed in. And everything that you've shared with us today, Ricardo, just echoes that message.
Here's another one for you, Jeff, that I heard that nature bats last. So if you want a t-shirt, there's another one for you.
Yes.
Very good. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments about this episode or anything that we're working on in the Engineering with Nature program, please give us a call or drop us a note. Details are on the Engineering with Nature website. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you'll join us again as we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN Podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN Podcast is produced by Eye Contact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.